Cool. This is the Gateway API meeting for June 15. We've got a few things on the agenda, but most notable is policy attachment. I'm not sure how long we'll spend on this, but I do want to time box it to say 40 minutes or so. So we have some time left over for PR and issue triage. There's a few items here that would be good to get to on that front.
Does it make sense to do it in reverse order?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't mind doing that. So I actually want to start on PRs because there's a few PRs that have just kind of gotten stuck. Conformance tests we talked about last week, they're moving. I'm actually increasingly okay with Godog. This PR, although it's marked,
really?
yeah,
What
I don't
changed your
know.
mind?
I don't know. I'm not sure. So it's scoped out and it works. I'll say that. A lot of the helpers from ingress controller conformance are helpful, but the thing I'm not sure of is if the extra bit of, I don't know, extra bit of abstraction here is helpful or not. So in this case, you basically have to know, okay, so I've got this test definition, and then I need to know to go to the file that actually defines it, that maps those sentences to functions, and then find those functions and understand what those functions are doing. And hopefully those descriptions are descriptive enough that you have a rough idea of what they're trying to do. But if you have an issue, if you have a whatever, you have to know how to translate a scenario like this into the code that is backing it. So yeah, I like a lot of the test structure I've got in right now. I am on the fence whether I think this extra layer of abstraction is good or bad. You look at this file and it's like, yeah, I completely understand what you're trying to do, but you try and debug any of this and you try and dig into it and it becomes a little bit more complicated. So I know I said I'm more okay with Godog, but I'm open to feedback on this one. I know there's already been a little bit of feedback on this PR, but if anyone wants to take a look at it, would appreciate it. It's still, it still is a work in progress. I've been testing it with Istio. I've been testing it with Contour. I've been, it's easier to write conformance tests when they pass, and for the most part, they do with Istio. Contour hasn't implemented status yet, so since I'm starting with status, doesn't really work that well, but you can see how it could. So anyway, that's the state of this. Interested in feedback. I have a corresponding PR that implements something like this without Godog, but I'd say Godog is really just kind of the layer on top. It's not that important in the grand scheme of things. All the helpers and all the functions are going to be similar. It's just whether you have the spec written in Go or written in something else.
That's kind of, if we can drastically simplify it, I'm all for that, and then just ripping out the Godog.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think, from a community standpoint, Godog is not something that, and I could be wrong here, I've seen in other spaces in the Kubernetes community. And second is this, the customers here are really implementers who I expect will be very, very familiar with Go testing. So just reusing that would make their life easy.
I agree with that, but I think, so where we got stuck in, well, stuck is the wrong word, but because the ingress controller conformance tests, which are quite new, happen to use Godog and happen to use this structure, we have to have a compelling reason not to. And I think we can make that argument.
I mean, like, if we could rip out Godog and then just replace it all in ingress conformance, that's actually not a terrible result.
Yeah.
It's mostly, so yes, it's kind of my fault, but the reason I liked Godog was what you're showing on the screen, which is this nice description that matched to some tests. Now, if we could do that in Go, which I think we discussed, like, hey, why don't we just put this in Go? That's fine. I think it's, as long as we have this description that people can read and understand as part of the spec, that's really what I wanted. Like, I think Kubernetes E to E is probably really bad for this. Like, you looking at the E to E test, you have actually no idea what the desired state was. Like, it's just like, do this, do this, do this, do this. And then, like, does it pass? Well, sure, but I don't know what it actually tested.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd say the Kubernetes conformance tests are, although somewhat simple and just an extension of E2E test, they for someone that is just trying to be conformant, it takes a lot of effort to read through those tests and understand what they should do.
So Boy, to dig a little deeper into that, what we expect if we have this file is anybody who's writing the test is disciplined enough to write this file and describe it properly. I mean, somebody could actually just, explain the code that they are writing in the test, and then we have the same problem, right?
Yeah, so it has to be structured. I sent Rob like a sketch we would actually have a reference to the documentation as like a field in a Go struct or something. So imagine replacing this with like a Go struct instead of this YAML, and it would actually literally like create a hyperlink to the documentation so that we can run through the structure and generate like a report with.
Got it. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Right, like that's really what we need. Like, forget all the English language, like, blah blah should have XYZ. Like, it really should just be that it can generate a report with all the test cases. You can make sense of each test case as like what it actually is, and then it links to the documentation that describe the spec or API or whatnot. And then someone who's implementing it can go run through, and if it fails, they can just click through to understand like where it's coming from, and then of course if there's some mismatch, then we can resolve it in upstream. But like, that's really what we need, not necessarily it's super fancy like English text description.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, I like the sound of what you're like just describing here. I think it's much smaller in scope and much easier to write test against and maintain, right? Like, what happens, Godog decides to, I don't know, pivot or whatever, right? So things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that all makes sense. I think this is all, I would say that the vast majority of this is code that translates easily to any top level test framework, even like, yeah, obviously there's not much to this, that this is easy to, just in subtest to define this in some kind of Go test. And this is really the only thing that's unique to Godog about this PR. So I am fine with experimenting just a little bit more with just vanilla Go tests again, like my other PR is doing. And I think it is pretty simple.
Yeah, I think like we wouldn't use vanilla out of the box because it doesn't create those kind of descriptions. So probably there will be some very minimal framework that is like a description of test cases.
Yeah.
I hesitate there because that does get into trouble
I don't want to
at some point.
Yeah.
But like the other thing with Godog that was cute but probably not that useful is that it actually takes these variables and exports them to the code, but the way it does it is pretty gross, so not clear it actually is like a net benefit.
Yeah, for context, this is what it looks like, right? So you've got, okay, this is a step, this maps to this function, this is a step, this maps to this function. You can see that, okay, I'm gonna map this, match, etc. It works, but it's just one more place for things to break, or fail in. Yeah.
The whole idea for like Cucumber is that like non-programmers can write the test cases, but you know,
Yeah.
like PMs,
Yeah.
like who needs PMs?
Hold up. Hey, I resemble that comment.
You're gonna be outnumbered pretty soon here, buddy.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
All right, well, sounds good. I've got a plan to work on with that, and I'll follow up. Harry, this one is yours. I forgot where this PR got stuck. Do you remember?
Yeah, I haven't looked at it either, but I think
Okay.
it's really, I think the one comment that you have, right?
All right. Yeah. 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 So this is basically where namespace, we got tied up on where namespace should be attached and really where port should be attached to, I think. Okay. All right, yeah, I remember this discussion. I was arguing that either we just shouldn't have service name, or maybe at least to start, we should just be adding anything more complex to backend ref. Like anything like namespace should just live there instead of having to deal with both service namespace and backend ref namespace. And if you need a more complex reference, it's in backend ref. I don't know if that makes sense.
So what I'm trying to recall here is how is like that related to clarifying requirements for port? Like how's the namespace requirement here related to, I mean, sorry, how is like port and namespace related here? I think it's more about what happens.
Yeah, okay, all right. So this really did become quite tangential. And it was yeah, the idea that port is optional with backend ref. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, backend ref can still be used to reference a service. And
I see.
Yeah. And so it was really just the tiniest point of clarification that then went into this rabbit hole of, well, should a backend ref really be used for a service reference?
Interesting.
Yeah. I lean towards saying, since there's not a great way to prevent it from happening, we might as well, like, I think service name is really just a shortcut to represent the same thing. But maybe my misunderstanding is incorrect, or maybe we shouldn't have service name. If this is confusing that there's two ways to do a thing, then maybe we shouldn't have two ways to do a thing.
I mean, I think the reason we resorted to that was like make it easy because 90% targets will be service.
Yeah.
We didn't want users to think about the backend.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think that's cool.
Sorry, go
That
ahead.
logic still applies, I think.
Yeah.
So what should be the path forward here? Like, should we do like is like clarifying?
Yeah. So
Go ahead.
I think what I should say, what might be clear here is port is optional for non-service backends, something like that. Basically, it's not necessarily it's optional with backend ref, because backend ref could still refer to a service. That's
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's reasonable. Yeah, I mean, it might be ambiguous because what you suggested, like you could have a service in backend ref. I don't know how many people will think through that.
yeah,
How many implementers and then users will get creative. So,
yeah.
okay, I can update to include more
Cool.
more language in there.
Cool. Thanks. Bowie, you've got a proposal for enhancement proposals. I think this just got lost.
Yeah, I'll resolve it. I think everyone's kind of in agreement. We'll just check it in
Yeah.
after
Okay.
fixing.
Yeah. Cool. Harry, you have a PR for request redirects. I got some feedback on here. It's still marked as work in progress. I think, yeah, draft.
Yeah, I mean, I really opened this up to figure out like how do people like this. So I know we have a couple folks there. Like, is this part of a filter? Do we want it not to be a filter? Like how, like, maybe folks on this call can give some additional context, and then I can sort of make it ready. The reason I didn't want to put in a lot of time into something that we weren't sure of doing it that way.
Yeah, this is a good question. I think of redirecting because our filters right now so far have primarily been modifiers or something like that doesn't affect the request. Well, so it could mirror the request. That's probably the closest thing to redirect. But other things are, modifying headers, things that are more modification than just, which I guess redirect is a bit of a modification. I don't know. You could make an argument that redirect is more similar in nature to forward to than filter. I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Yeah. Okay,
Hey,
so
guys.
I think maybe people need to take a look and comment then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
just
I
wanted to,
get. Sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I think it's more like filter should not be changing the routing, like like it's like cutting off a response, like it's taking a request and sending back a response. So like your filter chain won't be executed all the way through or things like that, and we don't want filters to do that. Is that is that what we are uncomfortable with?
So I don't know if I'm comfortable because I know we've left that open for other, like it's very possible that you'll have an authorization filter, and
Yeah, you can drop things in a filter.
right. And maybe that even redirect. I don't know. Maybe in some cases that doesn't redirect itself. I don't know. That I don't know. I don't have a good answer for where this belongs yet. I'd say this is one of two possible places.
With filter is that if you have a redirect filter, do you not put a destination? Like, where does it go if it's just feels a little strange to like not
Well,
have
we
an
do.
end.
So we have left forward to optional.
I see.
And that is with the idea that some filters may be terminal.
Oh, interesting.
So given that, it is possible to leave this in filter.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't seem super fundamental either way. We just need to make sure it's natural for the user to understand.
Yeah, I mean, there is this other argument here. I think is you cannot redirect at the gateway level if it's a filter. You have to specify a route to actually do that. Use that. I mean, is that like a gateway class functionality or feature, something that could be defined at that level, or like a policy reference or something like that?
What do you mean by redirect at the gateway level? You mean take all traffic in 80 and redirect it?
Yeah, that's like a common use case that we run into.
Is it that terrible to just have a route that matches everything and redirects?
It's not, and that's why I have this proposal. I'm just thinking out loud, like, is that okay for most users or not?
Feels not terrible.
Is there an argument to be made that route isn't the appropriate place for protocol or port redirects because it really doesn't have anything to do with, well, I shouldn't say that, but whereas something like gateway
Right,
could
like,
handle that, and this could be more of a path redirect.
no, because redirect is protocol specific. Like it has to be an HTTP redirect. It's not a.
Oh yeah, you're right.
It's not like a. There's no like TCP redirect or something.
Yeah, you're right.
I'm sure there was an attempt at some point.
We already have some HTTP specific concepts inside gateway, but yeah, that route is probably more natural.
Yeah, I would say you'd have to, because you could do like HTTP. Is it a 304 or a 30? Was the other one 6 or like? There's like options there.
Yeah, it's like 301, 302, 304, 307, 308. So.
Yeah, so like it is basically very HTTP specific.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so it should belong in route. Filter is not the worst place for it. It may be the best place. And
yeah,
we just
what's
need
the
to
alternative? Like maybe
I mean,
that's.
I think the only alternative is to make another top level field that is on the same level of forward to, that's just redirect to. And
I see.
I think that is adding more complexity than we need. I think a filter may be just
Yeah, I mean, we
fine
can
here.
always go back and add that field versus.
Yeah, so that was one reason that I was like, okay, let's use filters for these features, because I mean, we can argue it certain ways, but it increases API surface in a way that is easier to tackle or change, because filters are essentially extensions, right? So, and it also promotes filters more, and people can get more creative and get more value out of filters.
It makes a more obvious extension point too. Like that is basically going to end up becoming the primary place to extend a route in the filters section, which is easier to understand, I think, than having a lot of extension points within the same resource.
Yeah.
Just want to do a time check.
Yeah. I was just about to say the same thing. We're around halfway through. We did not make it too far through these PRs. So again, a reminder to so I actually, as I was looking before this meeting, I was wondering, why didn't this PR get in? It's so simple. And then I realized I forgot to follow up. I missed some feedback from you, Harry. So I will do that after this meeting. There's this one just got lost. It's got just okay, real quick, because I see it's got LGTM approved and then needs a rebase. Is it what do we need to wait on this one?
I think it's just me finding time, I think, in this one.
Okay, all right. I wasn't sure if that there was a
Sorry about
hold
that.
too.
Yeah.
No, that's completely fine. I was just wondering if you needed more consensus with the hold, or if there was anything else that needed broader.
It might have a conversation. I haven't looked at this in 2 weeks.
Oh yeah, that's it's a busy time. Okay, so I think that the big change here is that we would be using going from SNIs to host names as the field name inside TLS route, right?
Yeah, I think that's about it. This one.
Yeah. Okay. Let me run over to the proposal, because I did want to take some time on that. And if we have any time left over, I'll run with that. So this is kind of just another follow-up on Mark's original discussion around service policy. This got some good feedback from Nick and Steve and ongoing discussion. I responded to Nick yesterday on here, but I also linked to the doc that's linked in the agenda as well. Some of the concerns that Nick raised about any kind of policy attachment here is that if we're not careful, we're going to end up with, this kind of just API that's no longer portable, essentially, that more and more things get pushed into policy, get pushed into extension points, and we run the risk of a no longer fully portable API. I think this is a really tough balance as we're developing this API, but if we don't provide some kind of standard point for extension and policy attachment, then we run the risk of just the Wild West all over again, where every implementation builds their own way to extend the API, because we know that there are things that we simply cannot fit inside Gateway API that some implementations are going to want to support. So that's my rationale here for this doc and discussion. This is meant to be kind of establish a pattern, and this is, again, proposal, meant to establish some kind of a pattern for how we attach policy, both if we have some kind of core backend policy resource that we build on, or maybe it's called service policy, I don't know what it is. But if we have some kind of resource in tree that we can define that has some concepts, I think this pattern would be used. But also I think we would highly recommend that other implementations use the same pattern, so that as users switch between implementations of this API, they have a consistent experience when it comes to attaching additional policy. Obviously, this is something that we can't really enforce, just encourage, but I think it's still useful to have some guidelines here. So this is my first shot at it anyway. So goals that I had, one were to establish a pattern for policy attachment that, as I mentioned, could be used for policies included within the Gateway API spec. But in addition, for any implementation specific policies that are used along with Gateway API resources. So kind of both. Also, a really consistently desired concept is providing a way to distinguish between required and default values. Like somebody may want to attach policy at a higher level and say, I want these defaults to apply, but someone below can override this and that, or I have these required values that should not be overridden below. Similarly, enable policy attachment to really as many scopes as possible. We want to provide a pattern that could allow for attaching policy to a gateway, a route, a backend. And this isn't quite as clearly defined, but maybe we want policy to be attached to namespaces as a way of providing defaults or requirements within a namespace. And this is also providing a means of attachment that works for both ingress and mesh use cases of this API. I mentioned mesh specifically because it's a use case of this API that really policy is a key idea there. And I wanted to, as I was thinking about this, at least make sure that whatever we use for policy could at least work for that. I think there's plenty of different ways that policy could work well for both use cases. And so that was a goal. And provide a consistent way that both included implementation specific policies can be interpreted. So I think this is a really key idea here. I want to provide some kind of UX where, say it's a Coop Cuddle plugin or something, can interpret both any included policy resources and implementation specific ones and show a user which policy applies to their route, to their backend, to whatever it is. And I think there's a good path to do that. But again, just another goal. And finally, I did not want to try and define all potential policies that could be attached to a resource here, or the full structure and configuration of policies. This is primarily about a pattern and not so much the specifics of what goes in these resources. We've had plenty of discussion about what could be attached with policy, but for this, I really just wanted to focus on a pattern. And the solution that I've proposed is very similar to, what we've already discussed, I guess you could say. It's very similar to backend policy. And I also have some alternatives that I explored below this. And this is kind of just building on all of these concepts. The way I look at it is, if you take the existing backend policy and how that attaches, and you take Mark's ideas with service policy and you try and merge those together, you get something that looks kind of like this. So if you look at the ingress use case, it's pretty straightforward. You attach policy to a gateway or a route or whatever it may be, but in this case, the timeout policy references the gateway. So it says, I want to apply this timeout policy to this gateway. And this shows a few important things. One, anyone who can create a policy of this type can apply that policy to anything within the same namespace. So it's a slightly different way of authorization than a forward reference model, but I think it's actually pretty powerful. Well, as powerful as you could make it with RBAC, in the sense that someone within the namespace can control timeout policies, or can control, I don't know, retry policies, authorization policies. I don't know, whatever it happens to be. You can assign specific admins of those concepts, and they can attach those to resources within that namespace. That seems like a fairly powerful concept that gives us about as granular access control as we could hope for. So in this pretty simple example, this timeout policy would apply to all requests through this gateway. And of course, you can just blow this out and make it highly complex. So you could attach a policy here, you could attach a policy to the route, or you could attach a policy directly to a service. And again, this is these kind of what I would call them backward references, but from policy to target. And so they apply in this direction. This is, I think, more complex than we're going to see in real life. I hope it is, but it does show the different potential attachment points of policy here. Let me stop there, and because this is a lot of content here, and I'm not sure how much sense it makes. So any questions, comments, concerns? Cool. I'll keep on running. All right. The next concept is how this could apply to mesh. And this is a slightly different, but also very similar idea. This idea is, I want to apply a policy to requests from my namespace to this service. So this would be like let's say it's a mesh specific policy resource. And I want to attach this specific policy to any request from my namespace to this specific service, whatever it happens to be. This is a pretty common concept through the mesh implementations I've looked at, that the idea of a policy override, that I want to affect requests from my namespace to something else. So it can be as simple as that, or you can really just go all out and say, I want to have a highly complex example. And this is one that I think shows all the different permutations that could be possible with this policy attachment approach. So one, we're going to attach a timeout policy to a route. That route is going to apply to requests to this service. And it's going to say, hey, instead of sending traffic to this service, requests to this service should actually be split between foo A and foo B. And I really only want this specific routing and this specific policy to apply to this workload. This is like the uber complex example that has all the things. This is, I think, a powerful example of how you could use policy attachment and routing to do some powerful overrides. But again, this is a mesh specific example that I don't think really applies to ingress, but it shows how this same attachment mechanism can work reasonably well for both the traditional ingress use case, but also has potential for mesh use cases. Any questions on that? I know this example especially is a little intense.
So we expect these resources to standardize across meshes, right?
Yeah, that's the goal. Okay. So I think we expect these patterns to standardize across meshes, and obviously things like HTTP route, etc., would be standardized as much as possible. What I'm less sure of is the policy resources that a mesh implementation attaches here. So some of them, like, we're probably going to have some generic, I don't know, service policy, backend policy, whatever we call it, that is included inside the core API and the gateway API. And of course, we'd expect that to be portable across all implementations. But I think a lot of this discussion is also going to be about the types of policy that are unique to an implementation. And we want, at least I would like to see that attached in as consistent a way as possible. And I recognize that, and that's why I kind of split this out, is that I recognize that there's at least some interest in using these APIs for mesh. And I wanted to show that this attachment mechanism could provide a way for both traditional ingress use cases, but also I think it works for mesh. It will need some more feedback on this, but this is just, again, throwing out an idea of how it could work.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I've seen this pattern does exist in mesh products, at least a couple of mesh products that I'm familiar with. Kuma being one, that's by Kong. Yeah, and like this also overlaps with, like, I mean, it doesn't overlap with, but this follows the same pattern as network policy, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's plenty of overlap, at least in concept here. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, that's a good thing. I think most users,
Yeah.
I mean, the user personas are different here, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think is kind of powerful about this idea, is that we're taking really familiar concepts. Like, this is a concept that's familiar to gateway API already, and it applies to ingress. And you can look at this and say, well, hold on, this very similar concept applies pretty well to mesh. This pattern, like, I spent some time looking at other mesh implementations otherwise, and trying to find a pattern, and this seemed like a pretty common one. So if you can say, well, hey, this API is generic enough, but also provides this pattern that works well for both, I think that's pretty compelling.
I've been meaning to write something up, but I think that, like, this kind of is based on the belief that, like, there is one-to-one portability, or like what I would call like absolute portability, where it's like copy and paste, it'll work in any environment. And then there's conceptual portability. And I think that this is much more like this is conceptual portability, where the core concepts are portable, the resources themselves are not. They're all implementation specific, but the fact that the resources attach, all the implementation specific resources attach in the same manner, makes understanding the entire system much easier. So, right, it's like, again, it's just conceptual portability. And we should probably define that, because actually, like in at Google, we've been talking to other teams about this that have networking products, and they've like the first question is always, well, this isn't portable. Like, you can't copy and paste this and have it be portable. And like, I think that's kind of not the point. Is that's not really what users expect, right? Because there's so many implementation specific features, you couldn't use any of them. And so that's what I feel like is a more powerful concept.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think one of the things I'm excited about the potential of with this kind of consistent pattern is you can take, say, a Coop Cuddle plugin and describe all the policies that have been attached to your route or your backend, or that apply in a certain path. And it doesn't matter who's implementing those policies. It just, if they're all implemented using the same pattern, you can compute them in kind of a shared way. So the UX is very similar, even if the implementation specific policy is unique. That very familiar pattern, I think, is valuable here. All right, well, I'll keep on running. This is one that I kind of wanted to dig into more, and that's the idea of hierarchy. And this is something that Mark covered with the service policy proposal he had earlier, but the idea that, okay, so a policy referenced at a gateway is going to have precedence over a policy at a route over a backend kind of thing. And similar for a mesh hierarchy, it's almost the same thing, except your entry point is not a gateway, it's kind of a consumer workload. And so that's really the starting point of your hierarchy, and then it goes down from there. This is how I imagined the hierarchy working. And I also had this idea that, again, similar to Mark's original idea here with service policy, that you could have a required and a default concept here. So in this case, I'm using the example to be clear, this is nothing that this does not exist, but in just trying to give the idea of some kind of vendor specific policy out there, right? So you have a GKE service policy, and so you have this required concept, and so this requires that CDN is enabled, and there's no way to override that anywhere else and say that it is enabled false. This is what it has to be. And if something at a lower level says it's required for CDN to be off, then that's a conflict and that's an error state that we need to handle. But this clearly shows the intent of a policy. And then policy can also provide default values here. And you can override that at a lower level if you want. So in this case, you have one policy that's attached to a gateway and one policy that's attached to a route. And you can see how the route is overriding a default. Does this example make any sense? Again, it's probably familiar if you remember Mark's earlier proposal, but it's just a slightly different version of it.
I definitely think it makes sense. I guess the only question I had is a little bit bigger, is just be clear, are we talking about policy being only the implementation specific type parameters, or would it also be, say, like if I had like something policy about like my TLS config, something that's directly supported by the gateway API, yeah, but I wanted to apply it different, force different defaults or requirements.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do have a really similar concept built into the API for TLS config of allow override, and I think that applies. But for I think the more generic concept of policy that can fit inside Gateway API, inside the Gateway API spec, I think the same pattern would apply. In my mind, and I think Mark had written something like out earlier in an issue, the bar for policy becoming no longer implementation specific, but contained within the Gateway API spec is something I think we would want it to be supported by or supportable by maybe at least half of implementations. If less than half of implementations can support any given concept, I don't think we can argue that it's portable enough to be a, built-in policy. But if we can get concepts that have that level of support, I think we should push for them being included inside the Gateway API spec. And that's kind of an arbitrary, I don't think we'll be doing precise math here, but that's kind of a rough guideline for what I've been thinking.
Yeah, I think that basically as a first class part of the Gateway API, even if it's extended, which is like, not required by all implementations, but portable if it is supported, I feel like trending towards that, if possible, is always better because it ends up leading to a more streamlined API. Like if there's, like, for instance, weights. Like weights, I don't even know if that makes sense actually, but let's say that was part of policy. Right now it's a first class part of the API, and I think that leads to a more streamlined experience because probably an overwhelming majority of the implementations do support weights. So if possible, I think we should err towards first class, but I think the majority of the entire configuration universe around traffic and load balancing is probably not first class, just because of how much is out there.
Yeah, I'd say 95% of the time people are using 5% of the features, and those will be portable. And then all those kind of more obscure features that every implementation has are going to be harder to make portable. But like the core is something that's most people are going to be focused on, but allowing all these extra features I think is still very useful, and doing it in a consistent way I think is a good goal. Okay, so let me keep on running. I know we're running out of time here. I wrote down a bunch of implementation details that I thought would make sense here, but again, very open to feedback. Each controller would be responsible for populating the status. We don't have status, but we would have status on gateways and routes that included references to policies that had been applied to that gateway or that route. Unfortunately, we don't have a path to do this with services or namespaces yet, but I'm sure if this pattern becomes popular enough, we can try to add this to status on either of those resources upstream. This is really one, you look at this, all these examples, and it may feel overwhelming and complex. And one compromise that I think helps make this a little bit easier to understand is the idea that each policy can only target a single resource at a time. So if you want to apply to a broader scope, then target a higher level resource like a gateway or a namespace. And that can apply to multiple resources within that scope. But I think it gets overly complex if a policy resource can target just a whole list of resources. This may not be the correct concept here, but this is one path I saw that could potentially simplify things. This is a change or a feature that I have included specifically for mesh use cases. But a really common example in mesh is the ability to cross a namespace with a policy override. So I want all my traffic going to this service in another namespace to have this policy applied, for example. So in my mind, target references can cross namespaces, but policies referencing targets in other namespaces would only apply to traffic originating in the same namespace as the policy. So really, this is a mesh specific concept. I don't know how to differentiate this. I don't know if this is something like that only some policies, like only implementation specific mesh policies support. I haven't thought through this enough, but I think there's value in this being possible with the appropriate limitations. I thought a little bit about a Coop Cuddle plugin. If you label a CRD appropriately, like as an example, you have this, this is a policy CRD, then a Coop Cuddle plugin can read from the CRDs that existed in a Kubernetes cluster, understand which are policy resources, and then use Dynamic Client to read from them. As long as they're structured this way, you can compute policy in the same way, regardless of the policy type you're interacting with. So I think it actually is possible to provide a consistent UX and understanding of what policy applies where, as long as we enforce these patterns and label things appropriately. I worked through some advantages and disadvantages of this. I think this obviously is a pretty flexible approach. It's very similar to the existing patterns that have been proposed or already exist. It's much easier to attach policy to resources we don't control, like service or service import, whereas other forward reference models would require a policies field or label or something to do that. It really requires minimal API changes here. And related to that, if you're packaging an application or deployment that includes, say, route or something to expose your application, you don't need policies to be part of that templating. The policies can be bolted on just by targeting that resource that's included. So I think in a lot of ways, this is a simpler approach. Unfortunately, that does make it harder to understand which policies apply to a request. That's why we really need to focus on UX with well filled in status resource and hopefully a good plugin experience. Yeah, requires all policy objects to implement the same structure, the same target referencing. And yeah, so I've covered a lot here, and I know we're nearly out of time. I'll leave a couple minutes here. If anyone has feedback, let me know. I'm interested in what people are thinking about this.
Rob, I just pasted a comment. I think
Yeah,
I'm liking what I'm seeing. I think we need to think a little bit about is like, how do we go about enforcing this, right? Like, do we have some API reviews, or we can't really, we can't really have tests for these, or maybe we could if, something like that. Yeah, I mean, if it works with Coop Cuddle plugin or things like that.
yeah, I think a lot of this, right? It's almost like yeah, the Coop Cuddle plugin is really the source of all of this, right? If the Coop Cuddle plugin is responsible for calculating and describing how policy is computed, you can compare that with your own implementation of that policy to ensure it lines up. And obviously the plugin will complain if CRD is either not labeled as expected or the target ref is improperly formatted or does not include the fields it expects. So I think that's really, I mean, I guess the answer is we really need to focus on that experience. But if we do, I think that brings consistency pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah, I think, yeah, I can see a path there. So thanks for that.
Cool. Yeah, so this is a huge doc. There's a lot more I've thought of, and some open questions here about how this could be applied to other concepts. This is going to take some more discussion, I'm sure, but I wanted to at least introduce this concept today and get some initial feedback. But but I know we're at time now. So please feel free, add comments, whatever you're thinking on this, or follow up on the issue as well. And with that, since we're at time, I think I'll call it. Thanks so much for all the good feedback.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.